They told you she waited. They told you the knight's wife pressed her face to the cold glass and counted the seasons and kept faith and kept still. That is a story men wrote centuries later from warm rooms by men who had never once run an estate alone. Margaret Paston defended a fortified manor against an armed attack in 1449 while her husband was away. She managed the accounts, negotiated the leases, dismissed a steward she caught stealing, raised her children, and wrote some of the most vivid letters in the English language, letters that documented in extraordinary detail what it looked like to keep a household from falling apart, while the man whose name was on the deed was somewhere else entirely. She was not waiting, she was working. I am not a medieval woman, but I know something about keeping a thing together while a man you love is somewhere you cannot reach. My name is Eleanor. I was born in 1931. In a farmhouse outside a small town in Ohio, and I have lived long enough to understand that the women who waited have always been the ones who kept the world from falling apart. Come sit with me tonight. I have the lamp on. I have time. It is evening here. The lamp beside my chair throws a small yellow circle on the wall, and outside my window the dark has that particular Ohio quality it gets in autumn, soft, a little damp, smelling of leaves and turned earth and something woodsy underneath. I do not always know what season it is when I wake in the night anymore, but this evening I know. This is October, and October in Ohio has its own gravity. I was reading today. I do a good deal of reading now, which is one of the advantages of being old. No one expects you to be anywhere else. I was reading about medieval women, about what they actually did when their husbands rode away to war. Not what the stories say, not what the paintings show. The pale woman at the high window, the handkerchief, the searching gaze toward the horizon. What the actual historical records show in the household accounts and the letters and the court documents that survive. What they show is this: she managed. She ran the estate, she negotiated with the tenants, settled the disputes, ordered the supplies, disciplined the servants, paid the bills, preserved the food, maintained the walls, harvested the crops, collected the rents, raised the children, kept the records, and defended the property, sometimes against legal challenge, sometimes against armed men who thought a woman alone meant a property undefended. She did not wait. She worked. And the man came home, if he came home, to an estate that had continued more or less intact because of everything she had done that no one thought to write down. Reading that today, I set the book in my lap and looked out at October for a while, because I know something about that. Not the knights and the castles, of course. I have never been anywhere near a castle in my life, and the closest I came to a siege was the winter of 1943, when we couldn't get sugar and my mother had to make the Christmas pie with molasses and honey and still made it taste like something worth eating. But the larger shape of it, the thing underneath the story about waiting, that I know. My name is Eleanor. I was born on the 16th of February 1931 in a farmhouse 4 miles outside a town called Millbrook in Ohio. I am 93 years old, and tonight I want to tell you about my life. All of it, or as much as a long night will hold. The house I grew up in, the Depression years and the war years and the years after the war when everything felt new, and the years when everything felt settled, and then the ones when it wasn't settled at all. The losses, the quiet that comes after the losses, the ordinary days which were, in the end, the ones that mattered most. You don't have to remember a word of this. That is the gift of a night like tonight. I'll talk, and you'll listen, or you'll drift, and either way, something will have passed between us. I like to think of that. So, the house. Let me start there. Let me start with the smell of it in winter. There are houses you leave, and houses that never entirely leave you. The farmhouse in which I spent the first 18 years of my life was the second kind. I can close my eyes right now and walk through every room of it. I can feel the particular give of the second step from the bottom of the staircase. It had been loose since before I was born, and it was still loose the last time I set foot in it, because there was always something more urgent to fix. I can feel the cold of the linoleum in the kitchen under my bare feet on a winter morning before the stove was lit. I can smell it. That is the thing. The smell of that house has never entirely left me, and I am not sure I want it to. It was a plain farmhouse. 2 rooms downstairs, 2 up, with a lean-to kitchen built onto the back sometime before my parents moved in, white clapboard on the outside, though by the time I was old enough to notice such things, the white had softened to the colour of old teeth in the summer and turned grey in the rain. The front porch had 2 boards that needed replacing from the year I was about 8, and they needed replacing until the year the house was sold, which tells you something about the arithmetic of farm life and the way some things simply wait their turn. The kitchen was the warm centre of everything. My mother had a wood cook stove, a big black iron thing called a morning glory, and the name suited it because every morning it was her first task and her last concern at night. She fed it, coaxed it, learned its moods the way you learn the moods of something alive. In winter the kitchen was the only room that was truly warm, and on cold mornings we dressed in there, crowded together near the stove, a tangle of elbows and wool stockings while the windows ran with condensation. The smell of that kitchen in winter, wood smoke, not the polite chimney smoke smell you get from a fireplace, but the deeper working smell of a stove that has been burning since before dawn. Behind that, kerosene from the lamp on the table because the farmhouse did not have electricity until I was 11 years old, and even after it had electricity, the kerosene lamp stayed on the kitchen table out of habit and sentiment and the practical knowledge that power lines went down in ice storms. And under all of it, always, the smell of whatever my mother was cooking. Cornbread most mornings, bean soup on Mondays, because Monday was washing day and you couldn't have something that needed attention, bread on Thursdays. My father's name was Clarence. He was a quiet man, not in the way of sadness, but in the way of self-sufficiency. He had everything he needed inside himself and did not require a great deal of conversation to feel right with the world. He farmed, which in that part of Ohio in those years meant corn and soybeans and a kitchen garden and a small rotation of animals, mostly chickens, a cow named Fern who was indifferent to all of us, and the occasional pig. He got up before light every morning of his life except Sundays, and on Sundays he got up only a little later than usual because habits have more authority than calendar. My mother's name was Ruth. She was a different order of person from my father. Not louder exactly, but more present somehow, more oriented toward other people, more interested in what was happening in the world just past the kitchen window. She read everything she could get her hands on, which in a farmhouse 4 miles from town and no public library within reasonable distance meant the newspaper when it came, the Sears Roebuck catalogue from cover to cover, the Bible, a shelf of novels she'd brought from her own family home, and whatever the women at church were passing around among themselves. Before I tell you more about her, I want to tell you about the land, because the land shaped everything. 4 miles from Millbrook, which was not a large town, a grain elevator, 2 churches, a barber shop, a general store with a post office in the back, a hardware store, and in later years a 5 and dime. Beyond the town, fields, and beyond the fields, more fields. Flatland, Ohio land, the kind that goes on until the sky stops it. And in winter, when the snow was on the ground and the sky was that particular pewter color it gets in January, you could stand at the edge of the east field and feel that you were on the surface of something very large and very patient. I was not a child who was afraid of that feeling. I liked it. I liked being small in something large. The house sat back from the county road at the end of a dirt lane that turned to mud in spring and froze solid in December. In summer, the lane was edged with Queen Anne's lace and chicory, that blue, that particular roadside blue, and you could walk down it in the evening and hear the meadowlarks in the tall grass and feel that there was nowhere in the world quite as good as here. In winter, it was something else. In winter, the lane was hard as iron, and the wind came across the flat fields with nothing to stop it, and you walked fast with your head down and arrived at the house grateful for the warmth of any room you stepped into. We were 4 children. My brother Thomas was the oldest, 7 years ahead of me. Then a sister who died before I was born, of something nobody spoke about directly. This was the way in those years. The children who were lost simply became a quietness in the air, a gap in the family without a name. Then me, then my sister Dorothy, who was 2 years behind me and who has been my closest friend in the world for 91 years and counting, which is something I take as evidence that the universe occasionally manages something right. Thomas and I shared a room until I was about 9 and he was 16 when he moved himself into the lean-to by the kitchen so we could have separate spaces. An act of older brother generosity that I did not fully appreciate at the time and have thought about with gratitude ever since. Dorothy and I shared a bed for as long as we both lived in that house, and long into adulthood we both had the habit of sleeping closer to one edge than the other, because the other edge was where you expected someone else to be. The bed had a mattress stuffed with corn husks, A good mattress, a proper mattress, would come later, and in winter we slept under quilts that my mother and grandmother had made, 3 of them stacked in the coldest months, heavy as a small animal settled across you. I have slept under expensive blankets since then, and in comfortable beds in good houses, and I will tell you honestly that nothing has ever made me feel quite as safe as those corn husk quilts, and the sound of my sisters breathing beside me, and the particular cold outside, warm inside smell of that upstairs room in January. The outhouse was 30 feet from the back door. In winter, you did not linger. You came back inside fast, and the cold came in with you like a guest you hadn't invited, and it took a few minutes by the stove to feel yourself again. I am telling you this not because it is exotic. For many of the people listening tonight, this is simply life in those years, but because it shaped you. It shaped how you thought about warmth, about shelter, about the small, ordinary reliefs of being inside. You never took them for granted when you had proof every single winter morning that they were not guaranteed. The land in summer. I should tell you about that too, because it was a different country from the winterland, a different life almost. The kitchen garden my mother kept was not small, and it was not decorative. It was functional in the way that the stove and the well were functional. It was the thing you depended on, the thing that stood between your family and going without. Tomatoes, green beans, corn, squash, cucumbers, potatoes, onions, beets, and in the good years, sweet peas along the fence, because my mother believed in beauty as a category of necessity, not as a luxury, and she was right. We canned through August and September, long hot days in the kitchen, all the windows open, the jars lined up on the table waiting their turn, the lids sealing with that small decisive pop that meant you had done it right, that the summer's work had been fixed in glass and could last the winter. There was a satisfaction to it that I still feel in my hands when I think about it, the lifting and the turning and the knowing that what you were doing mattered in the most practical possible sense. My father's barn was red. I don't know why I have always thought that detail important, but I have. A red barn against a blue winter sky and the thin smoke from the farmhouse chimney and the white of the fields. It is one of the images that comes to me most often when I close my eyes and look back. It does not contain a lesson. It is simply what it was. A place, a particular light at a particular time of morning, evidence of a life lived. I loved that house. I have lived in better houses since, houses with central heating and indoor plumbing from the start and floors that did not creak in certain weather, and I have been grateful for all of it. But none of them were home in the way that house was home, which is perhaps simply what it means to be born somewhere. You carry a copy of it inside you for the rest of your life. And on nights like tonight, it comes back very clearly. The smell of it in winter, wood smoke and kerosene and cornbread and cold, that is where I began. There is something I should tell you about my mother before I move forward. She kept a small tin of peppermints on the kitchen windowsill, and she gave us one apiece on Friday evenings as a mark of the week's end. Just one. On a farm where candy was a rarity, where penny candy at Millbrook's General Store was a genuine occasion, not a casual habit, that single peppermint on a Friday evening had a significance entirely disproportionate to its size. I can taste it now, the sharp cold of it dissolving on the tongue, the particular Friday feeling that accompanied it. She was teaching us something, I think, though she would not have called it teaching. She was teaching us that pleasure is keener when it is not constant, that the ordinary thing, given with care and on a specific occasion, becomes extraordinary. I have thought about it many times since, about what we lose when we make pleasure available at all times and in all quantities. I am not romantic about deprivation. I am simply saying that my mother's one Friday peppermint has outlasted in my memory every piece of candy I have ever eaten since, and that there is a principle in that worth knowing. Wind down with me now. The first chapter of a life is always the longest to tell because it contains the whole background, the land and the people and the arrangements that will shape everything that follows. Let me close this one here, in the kitchen of the farmhouse, with the smell of the stove and the sound of the wind and the particular warmth of a place that was exactly enough. There was also the party line telephone. We shared a line with 4 other families in the rural area, which meant that picking up the receiver at the wrong moment, you might find yourself inadvertently party to someone else's conversation, a situation that required a particular delicacy of response, the quiet replacement of the receiver, the pretense of having heard nothing. We were all very good at this. The party line was simultaneously a utility and a community institution in that it kept everyone within range of everyone else's business whether they wished it or not. My grandmother came to stay with us 2 or 3 times a year, sleeping in the small room off the parlour that was otherwise used for storage. She was a tall, angular woman with white hair pinned up and opinions about most things that she delivered without preamble. She had been born in 1877 in a farmhouse not entirely unlike ours, and she carried the quality of someone who had lived through enough that very little surprised her anymore. She had seen the arrival of the telephone and the automobile and the radio, and now she would sit at the kitchen table while my mother worked and speak her mind about whatever was passing through it. And my mother would listen with the attention that a daughter who has moved 4 miles away owes the mother she was raised by. I learned from watching those 2 women talk across the kitchen table, not the content of their conversations, much of it was too adult for me to pass, but the quality of it, the ease, the way 2 women who know each other well can cover enormous ground quickly, can move between the trivial and the serious without ceremony, can say the true thing plainly because they are not performing for anyone. That quality in conversation, that particular female plainness and speed and willingness to address what actually matters, is something I have valued ever since and found, in the years since my grandmother and my mother are both gone, less available than it used to be. I was born in 1931. That fact carries more information than it seems to. It means I arrived in the world 2 years after the stock market fell, and in the same year that thousands of banks across the country were failing, and the men who had farmed the Midwest were watching their soil blow away in clouds that reached to the horizon. It means that my earliest memories exist in what historians have since called the Great Depression. Although no one in our household used that term, we called it simply things being hard, which was the rural way of describing an emergency that had become ordinary. I want to be careful about how I tell this. There is a kind of nostalgia about poverty that I distrust, the kind that makes hardship seem like character building, and simplicity seem like wisdom, and doing without seem like a choice rather than a condition. It was a condition. My parents did not choose it. They managed it, which is different. What I remember most clearly about those early years is not the absence of things, but the presence of my mother's ingenuity. She had a gift, and I use that word deliberately, for making something from very little. Not in a sentimental way, but in a practical, unsentimental, systematic way. She kept a mental catalogue of what could substitute for what could be stretched or repurposed or done without entirely, and she operated from that catalogue every single day without complaint, and often without comment. Sugar was expensive, so she substituted molasses where she could. Molasses in the cornbread gave it a darker colour and a richer flavour, and she kept right on making it that way long after sugar became affordable because she had come to prefer it. This is the thing about deprivation that I have come to understand in the years since. Sometimes you discover in the process of making do that the substitute is better. Not always, often not, but sometimes. And you hold on to those discoveries. Flour came in printed cotton sacks, and those sacks became dresses. My mother kept the patterns in a box in the bedroom closet, and when a new sack arrived, she would hold it up to the light and consider the print before she decided which dress or apron or pillow cover it was suited to become. Dorothy and I wore flour sack dresses to school for years. They were good dresses, well made, properly hemmed, pressed on Saturday night for Sunday church. The fact of their origin was understood by everyone in the community and therefore required no comment. We did not feel shame about it. Shame requires a gap between expectation and reality, and in our community, the expectation and the reality were the same. The Sears Roebuck catalogue arrived once a year and was the most looked-at object in the house. Dorothy and I spent hours with it, turning the pages slowly, considering, discussing. There was no real prospect of ordering from it. Most of it was purely theoretical pleasure. But the catalogue was also a kind of education. It showed you what existed in the world, what could be made and sold and shipped, what people somewhere else were buying and wearing and furnishing their homes with. It made the world larger without requiring you to go anywhere. What we ate. I want to tell you what we ate because food is where the economics of a household show most clearly. Beans were the center of our diet through most of my childhood. Navy beans, dried, soaked overnight, cooked all day Monday on the back of the stove while my mother ran the washing. Bean soup with a ham hock when we had one, which was not always. Cornbread alongside always. Green beans from the garden in summer, preserved in winter. Potatoes in every form my mother could devise. Eggs from our own chickens, and occasional chicken meat, though not often. A chicken that was laying was more valuable alive than on the table, and my mother calculated that balance with precision. Salt pork was the fat that flavored most things. A piece of salt pork in the bean soup, a small piece fried and served with biscuits on Sunday mornings, the drippings saved and used for cooking through the week. Nothing was discarded. The word waste was not spoken in our house except as a reproach. My father's situation through those years was better than many men's because he owned his land, a small piece of it, 40 acres, but his own, not rented, not mortgaged heavily enough to lose. He had inherited it from his father, and having land meant having something concrete to hold on to in years when other men were losing everything that was not solid underfoot. He lost money in those years. He fell behind on the property tax more than once, but he did not lose the farm. We were lucky. I knew that even as a child, in the way children absorb the large facts of their situation without quite understanding them. There was barter in those years, more than I think younger people understand. Our community ran on an informal economy that had nothing to do with money. We had eggs. The Hendersons down the road had a cow and therefore butter and buttermilk. My mother had skill with needlework. Mrs. Garrison had a garden that produced more sweet corn than her family could eat. My father could fix things, machinery, structures, whatever needed fixing, and that skill was worth something in a community where everyone had things that needed fixing and not much money to pay someone to do it. I am telling you this not because it is remarkable, but because it is what community looks like when the formal economy fails. People revert to the older arrangements, to the network of mutual obligation and reciprocal need that underlies any functioning group of humans. We helped the neighbors because the neighbors helped us. There was not much sentiment in it. It was practical, and it worked. The thing about poverty that I did not understand until I was grown is that it does not announce itself as poverty when you are inside it. When every family you know is living the same way, the way you are living feels simply like the way things are. I did not know, as a child, that I was missing anything, because missing something requires knowing it exists. I did not know until I was perhaps 9 or 10 and went to a birthday party for a girl in town whose father was a doctor, and there was cake, real cake, white cake with frosting from a tin, and a kind of food that I had not understood existed, which was food that was purely for pleasure, not for sustenance, not to fill you up, but simply to taste good. I ate 3 pieces of that cake. I have felt slightly sheepish about it ever since, and I have also never forgotten what it tasted like, and I think those 2 facts are related. My father almost never spoke about money, except in the plainest practical terms. We have enough for this. We don't have enough for that. He did not worry out loud. He did not dramatize. He simply worked every day in the manner of a man who had understood early that anxiety was a luxury he could not afford, and that most of the things that worried other men would be better addressed by getting up and doing the next thing. My mother was different. She worried. She kept the worry mostly to herself, but I knew, because I was the kind of child who noticed things and remembered them. I saw the way she looked at the account book sometimes on winter evenings, a small cloth-covered book she kept in the drawer of the kitchen table, and the expression on her face when she closed it was not the expression of a woman who was satisfied with what she had seen. It was the expression of a woman who had done the arithmetic and found that it came out acceptable, just barely, and would need to come out acceptable again next month, and the month after that, and that was simply the shape of her life. She never said, "This is hard." She said, "We will manage," and then she managed. I have thought about her a great deal in the years since, and about what it cost her to carry all of that so quietly, and about what it gave us, her children, to have been shown what management looks like when it is done without drama. There is a kind of strength that is quiet and daily and entirely invisible until the day you look back and understand that everything you have was built on it. She was 26 years old in 1931. 26. Younger than my grandchildren are now, running a household in a depression with 4 miles of dirt road between her and the nearest town, and a husband who was doing everything he could and still not quite enough, not waiting for things to get better, making them better in the small ways that were available every single day. I understand now what I could not have articulated then. She was doing exactly what the medieval chatelaine did, what women in hard circumstances have always done, managing the gap between what is needed and what is available, with whatever tools are at hand and whatever ingenuity God or experience has provided. Not heroically, habitually, because it had to be done and she was the one doing it. The depression years eased as I grew older. By the time I was 8 or 9, things were still difficult, but differently difficult. There was a sense that the worst had passed, or was passing. My father got a small amount of work through the New Deal programs, road grading for the county, and that cash money was startling in our household because we had become so accustomed to operating without it. My mother put most of it in the coffee tin she kept at the back of the shelf, and she did not spend it unless she had to, because she had learned in the preceding years that something was always coming that you had not planned for. Those years are in me still. I do not mean this as a complaint, I mean it as a simple fact. The habits of economy that I developed then, the reflex towards sufficiency rather than abundance, the attention to what things cost and what they are worth, the instinct to save rather than spend, the understanding that enough is not just enough but is actually a kind of wealth, all of that was laid down in those early years, and it has never entirely lifted. I am 93 years old and I still do not like to waste food. I still feel a small pinch of unease when something is discarded that could have been kept. That is the depression in me, and I have stopped trying to argue with it. But let me wind down from the hard years for a moment, because there is something else I want to tell you about being a child in that house, in that time. Something about the sweetness of it which coexisted with the difficulty without contradiction. Summer evenings, when the work was done and the light was going slow and gold across the fields. My father on the porch in the wooden chair he had made himself, too tired to say much but content to be still. My mother with her mending in her lap because she was never without something in her hands. Dorothy and me in the yard chasing fireflies, the jar with the holes punched in the lid already ready and waiting because we did this every summer evening from June to August. The quality of that light, the sound of the crickets starting up, the particular satisfaction of a jar full of small cold lights, and then the opening of the jar and the watching of them rise and scatter. We let them go. Always. Every evening. My mother insisted. You caught them because the catching was the pleasure, not the having, and then you let them go. I think about that sometimes, about what my mother was teaching us in the particular quiet way she taught us everything, not by saying it, but by doing it, by being a woman who understood the difference between catching and keeping, and who gave us that understanding by example without once explaining it. Come back with me now, into the kitchen. The stove is warm, the lamp is on. The molasses cornbread is in the pan, and my mother is closing the account book with her particular expression, and everything is acceptable, just barely, and will need to be acceptable again tomorrow, and she will see to it that it is. That is enough for this chapter. Let me move forward now to the years when the world arrived. One thing I have not told you about those years is the church. In our community, in those years, the church was not separate from daily life in the way it might be now. It was woven into it. We went on Sundays naturally, but the church was also where news travelled, where help was organised, where the community's relationship with its own difficulties was given a framework. The minister's wife kept a list, informal but comprehensive, of which families were struggling most severely, and food and clothing and small practical assistance moved from household to household through a network that operated through the church but was not, strictly speaking, religious in its function. It was community in the old sense, which is a different and more demanding thing. I want to tell you one more thing about the Depression years before I leave them, something small. There was a man who came through once or twice a year, a travelling salesman, or perhaps simply a man who travelled and sold things along the way, who had a pack on his back and sold needles and thread and small useful items from house to house. He always stopped at our farm. My mother always bought something, even in the years when buying anything was a true sacrifice, because she understood that this man was also managing, and that turning him away empty-handed when you had anything at all to give was a choice you would have to live with. She bought needles. She could always use needles. And she would hand him a cup of coffee through the door and he would drink it on the porch and say thank you and go. Now, if you are finding some comfort here, I am glad. I post a new evening like this each week. Another night of stories, another life told slowly. Come back whenever the dark feels long. You are always welcome here. And if you would rather listen than watch, our entire library is available as an audiobook on Spotify. The link is in the description below or pinned in the first comment. Find me there. The school was a one-room schoolhouse called Millbrook Township District No. 4, which is a long name for a small building, but the rural townships in those years took their record-keeping seriously, as if the careful naming of things might establish their permanence. 8 grades, 1 teacher, a wood stove in the corner, 2 outhouses behind the school, and a flagpole out front from which the flag went up every morning with a solemnity that we were too young to find excessive. The walk was 2 miles. In good weather, this was nothing. Ohio farm children walked everywhere and thought nothing of it. In winter, it required a particular kind of preparation and a particular kind of will. My mother bundled me in wool until I was approximately spherical, and I walked those 2 miles in boots that were good boots but not quite the right boots, because the right boots cost more than the budget would allow, and you learn to live with approximate warmth. My first teacher was Miss Harriet Webb. She was young, 22 or 23 when I started, the age my grandchildren are now, which seems extraordinary to me in retrospect. She had graduated from the normal school in Columbus and come to us via a placement system that sent young teachers to rural districts for their first few years. She stayed 5 years with us, longer than most, and I think she stayed because she liked us, or liked the work, or both. She taught all 8 grades simultaneously, which required a kind of orchestration I have since come to think of as genuinely impressive. While she was working with the older students on long division, she had the younger ones reading aloud to themselves, or practicing handwriting on their slate boards, or memorizing passages they were meant to recite. The room hummed at a certain pitch that was the sound of multiple kinds of learning happening at once, and I found it, as a child, deeply reassuring. Busy rooms feel safer than quiet ones when you are small. She taught me to read. I know that sounds ordinary. Teachers teach children to read. That is what school is for. But I mean that she taught me to love reading, which is a different and rarer thing. She seemed to understand that reading was not a skill to be acquired and set aside, but a habit to be formed and protected. On Friday afternoons, when the week's work was done, she would read aloud to all 8 grades at once. Stories, poems, chapters from novels. She read with expression, with genuine pleasure, as if she herself was discovering the story in the reading of it. I listened with my chin in my hands and my whole self forward. The books she gave me to take home. Oliver Twist. I was perhaps 10 when I read it, and I understood about a third of it, but the part I understood was enough to keep me reading through the night by the light of the kerosene lamp, which my mother found when she came down for water at midnight and did not have the heart to stop. She pulled her cardigan tighter and looked at me for a moment and then went back to bed without saying anything, which was the most generous thing she could have done. I read everything. The school's small library, perhaps 40 books, I had finished before I was 10. Miss Webb began lending me her own books, which I treated with a reverence approaching the religious. She let me borrow them over summer vacation, and I returned them in September, wrapped in the same brown paper she had wrapped them in, because I had learned from watching her how to care for a thing that deserved care. Then the radio. We got a radio in the fall of 1938. I was 7. My father bought it, a used Zenith console, a tall wooden cabinet with a dial that glowed amber in the dark, from a man in Millbrook who was replacing it with a newer model. He brought it home on the back of the truck and carried it into the living room, which in our house was the room we used for company and serious occasions, and set it against the wall next to the window and plugged it in, and sound came out of it. I cannot adequately describe what the radio meant to us. I understand that this is difficult for anyone who has grown up with constant media available from birth to imagine, that a piece of furniture that produced voices and music could seem like a miracle, but it did. It produced the world in our living room. It brought distance into our house. We listened to Jack Benny on Sunday nights. We listened to the farm reports in the morning while my father got ready for the day, and he would stand in the kitchen doorway in his overalls and listen to the commodity prices with an expression of focused attention that he gave to very few things. We listened to Edward R. Murrow reporting from London during the early years of the war in Europe. Those dispatches that began, "This is London," in that flat, particular, serious voice that somehow communicated, even through static and distance, that what was happening there was real and close and not to be treated lightly. The radio changed what I knew the world contained. Before the radio, the world was the farm, the county road, Millbrook, the school. After the radio, the world was more. There were places with names I had never heard that people on the radio talked about as if they were as real as our county road. There were songs, Glenn Miller's orchestra, which came through the radio on Saturday evenings, and which produced in me at age 8 a physical response I could not have explained then and can barely explain now, the way the sound of it seemed to go directly into the body, bypassing the mind entirely. My mother listened to the soap operas in the afternoons while she was ironing. This was a secret of sorts. She did not think of herself as the kind of woman who listened to soap operas, but she did, and she listened with full attention, And sometimes I came home from school and found her standing at the ironing board with the iron arrested in midair and her eyes focused on something that was happening in the radio, not in the kitchen. School expanded to contain the world that the radio was introducing. Miss Webb began to talk more about geography, places that appeared in the news, countries that were being named in the dispatches that came through the wireless. She hung a large world map on the wall between the windows, and we looked at it and located the things the radio was talking about. Europe, which was very far away, was suddenly needing to be located. England, France, Germany. I was 11 years old in the fall of 1942. By then, we were in the war, and the world in the radio was not abstract anymore. But before I get to the war years, there is something else I want to tell you about those school years, something smaller. The Saturday matinees. Once or twice a year, not more, because the 10 cents admission required deliberate saving and a particular alignment of circumstances, my mother would give Dorothy and me each a dime, and we would walk the 4 miles into Millbrook and sit in the dark of the town's single-screen cinema and watch whatever was showing. Gene Autry sometimes. Shirley Temple, who made Dorothy cry every single time. The cartoons that played before the feature, which I liked almost better than the feature. What I remember is the dark, the specific quality of the cinema dark, not the dark of a country night, which is a large, open, breathing dark, but the enclosed, shared dark of a room full of people, all looking at the same bright rectangle, all quiet together, all temporarily in the same place that was not quite any real place. That felt even at 9 or 10 like something important about what it meant to be human, that we could do this, gather in the dark and look at something together and agree, for a while, to be somewhere else. I have thought about it many times since. Miss Webb would have approved of the thinking. She was that kind of teacher, the kind who wanted you to think, not just to remember, the kind who believed that a person who could notice what something meant was a more useful person than one who could only report what happened. I was not a remarkable student. I was diligent and curious and quick to read, but I was not brilliant, and I knew it, which was fine. What I was persistent. I wanted to understand things. I was willing to sit with something I did not understand until it became clear, which is not a skill that gets you praised in school, but is, I have found, one of the more useful ones for life. Miss Webb left us in the spring of my 5th grade year. She married a man from Columbus, and that was that. Women teachers in those years were required to leave their positions when they married, which strikes me now as a remarkable waste of talent and experience, though at the time it simply felt like the natural order of things, which is how injustice always manages to feel from inside it. I cried when she left. I am not someone who cries easily. I stood in the schoolyard on her last day and watched her car drive away down the county road and felt that something had ended, which it had. The world had introduced itself to me through her, and now she was gone, and I would have to continue the introduction on my own. I did. That is what you do. When someone who taught you to love something leaves, you keep loving it, because the loving belongs to you now, not to them. The books she lent me, the map on the wall, the radio in the living room, and the voice from London, all of it mine now, to carry forward. The next teacher was a man named Mr. Greer, who was adequate in the way that adequate people are adequate, and who left me more or less to my own devices, which was its own kind of education. There is one more thing about that period that I want to tell you. It concerns a particular afternoon in, I believe, the spring of 1941, when I was 10 years old and walked the 2 miles home from school along the county road and stopped where the road crossed the railroad tracks and watched a train go past. I had seen trains before. The tracks ran through the edge of Millbrook, and there was a small station there, and trains passed through twice a day. But this particular afternoon I stopped and watched this particular train go past, and something happened. The train was going south. I could tell by the way it came from the direction of the city, and it was long, 20 or 30 cars, moving with the specific authority of something very large and very certain of its direction. And as it passed, I felt, very clearly and suddenly, the size of the world it was moving through. All the places the train had been, all the places it was going, all the people in it, all heading somewhere, all with their own counties and their own schools and their own mothers listening to soap operas with the iron arrested in mid-air. I stood there until it was past and the sound of it had faded down the tracks, And then I walked the rest of the way home and did not say anything to anyone about it, because there was nothing to say about it that would have sounded like anything except I watched a train go by, which was not what I meant. What I meant was, the world is very large and I am in it, and that is going to matter. Now the evening is settling into itself a little. Let me move toward the years when the large world arrived at our door. There was a teacher I want to tell you about briefly before I leave the school years. Not Miss Webb, but a woman named Mrs. Abernathy who taught at the Sunday school at our church when I was about 12. She was not a professional teacher. She was a farmer's wife, like most of the women I knew, but she had a quality that I have thought about since, a quality of taking ideas seriously in a way that was not common in those years in that place. She would say, "What do you think about that?" And she would wait for the actual answer, not the correct answer, and she would respond to whatever you said as if it was worth responding to. When Miss Webb left and Mr. Greer arrived, I had already understood something important, that the love of learning would have to be largely self-sustaining going forward, and that this was fine because I had the radio and the library in the next town that I could reach by bicycle in summer, and a mother who did not object to the kerosene lamp burning past 10 o'clock. Self-sustaining is not the same as solitary. It means you have internalized the habit well enough that it runs on its own, and that the people and the institutions and the teachers who lit the fire have done their work and you can carry it from here. I want to say one more thing about the radio. There was an evening in the winter of 1940 when I was sitting on the floor near the radio's cloth-covered speaker doing homework, and a piece of music came through it that stopped me entirely. I did not know what it was. I did not know how to find out. There was no way in 1940 in rural Ohio to immediately learn the name of a piece of music you had heard on the radio. I simply listened, and when it was over, I sat there for a moment with the pencil in my hand and thought, that is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. I still do not know what it was. The not knowing has become part of the memory. It was a Sunday. We knew it was Sunday because we had come home from church and my mother was in the kitchen and the radio was on at a volume we usually reserved for the farm reports and the serious programs. I was 10 years old. It was December 7th, 1941. The voice on the radio was different. Not Glenn Miller, not Jack Benny, not Edward R. Murrow doing his regular London dispatch. Something had happened. The words were being repeated because the information was too large for a single telling. My father came in from putting the truck away and stood in the doorway and listened, and his face did something I had never quite seen it do before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of settling, like a man who had feared something for a while and now had the confirmation and could stop fearing and start dealing. Pearl Harbor, we are at war. I did not at 10 fully understand what that meant. I understood it in the way children absorb large events, through the responses of the adults around them, through the changes in the texture of daily life, through the gaps that begin to appear where certain people used to be. The gaps appeared. Boys from Millbrook, boys I knew from school or from church or from the county fair. Boys who were 17 and 18 and 19 years old were gone by the spring of 1942. Thomas, my brother, was 18 that year and gone with them. He enlisted in March. My mother packed his things in the good suitcase, the one that had come with her from her own family home and that normally lived on the high shelf in the bedroom closet, and when he drove away in a neighbour's truck toward the bus station in the next town, she went inside and the door did not close all the way behind her. My father was 41, not eligible. He stayed and worked and we continued. I want to tell you about continuing. The ration books arrived, tan booklets with red and blue stamps that you detached along the perforations to pay for things, not with money, but with points, a system of organized scarcity that the government administered because the arithmetic of a country at war required that what went to the soldiers had to come from somewhere. Sugar was rationed first, then meat, butter, gasoline, coffee, shoes. My mother had 3 ration books, hers, my father's, Dorothy's, and mine, and she managed them the way she managed everything, with attention and without waste, and with the background knowledge that this was temporary. Everything was temporary, and temporary could be endured. The Victory Garden expanded. What had always been a substantial kitchen garden became something larger and more purposeful. We were not simply feeding our family now, we were doing our part, which is what the posters and the radio programs and the newspaper said, and which was true in the plainest possible sense. More beans, more tomatoes, more potatoes. Whatever could be canned and put by was canned and put by. I was 12, 13, 14 during those years. and I took my place in the garden work without being asked because that was the arrangement in our household. You worked according to your capacity, and my capacity was growing. I learned to can tomatoes in the summer of 1943. I learned to make victory cake, which was a cake made without eggs or butter, a sort of organized deprivation presented in cake form, and which tasted, I will be honest, like the idea of cake rather than cake itself. But we ate it and were grateful and did not complain, because complaining about a victory cake in 1943 required a degree of tone deafness that nobody in our household possessed. Nylons disappeared. This is a small thing in the accounting of a war, but it registered with the women around me in a particular way. The older girls and women in Millbrook who had been wearing nylons drew the seam line on the back of their legs with eyebrow pencil and went about their business. I find something both funny and admirable about this. The determination to maintain a certain appearance, to refuse the erasure of ordinary female pleasures, even in the middle of a war, with a cosmetic pencil. The letters. I want to tell you about the letters. Thomas wrote home twice a month. His letters were V-mail, the small reproduced versions that the military made by photographing letters and reducing them to save shipping weight. The letters were short because he was young and had not yet learned that letters are for saying the things you cannot say in person, and because the censors had removed anything that might have been of military use, which left the letters somewhat emptied of specific content. He was somewhere warm. He was well. He ate something he didn't like. He thought of us. My mother read his letters at the kitchen table with her coffee, and she read them more than once. I watched her. I was old enough to watch and understand what I was watching. A woman reading a letter from a son who was alive, looking for evidence that he would remain alive, reassuring herself that he was present in the words. She folded them and put them in the tin box she kept on the shelf in the bedroom, the same tin box that held their marriage certificate and the children's birth records and the deed to the farm. His letters went in there, into the category of things that had to be kept. Then there was Mrs. Henderson. The Hendersons lived half a mile down the county road, and Mrs. Henderson had 2 sons in the Pacific. She was a large, capable woman, the kind who organized church suppers and kept a clean house and said exactly what she thought, and I had never once seen her at a loss. One morning in the late summer of 1944, a government car came down the county road and turned into the Henderson Lane, and we knew, the way you know things in a small community, where all the information travels and nothing is private, what a government car in the lane meant. That is the thing about waiting. It is not passive. Mrs. Henderson, while she was waiting, had continued to be Mrs. Henderson, organized, capable, present, running her household with efficiency and going to church and making the church suppers and doing her part. The waiting was not what she was doing. It was what she was doing around. And then the car came. Years later, many years later, I was perhaps 60, 65. I read something that stopped me in the way a particular sentence will occasionally stop you when it says something you have known but not articulated. I was reading about medieval women, about the Châtelenzie, the women left in charge of a castle or an estate when the lord went away to war, and what I read was this, that the word waiting is a mistranslation of what they were doing. The historians who had written about them in romantic terms had looked at the absence of the husband and concluded that his wife was waiting for his return. What they found when they looked at the actual records, the household accounts, the correspondence, the legal documents, was that she was managing, not waiting for things to happen, making things happen, directing the household, resolving disputes, negotiating with merchants, maintaining the walls, governing. I thought about my mother reading Thomas's letters at the kitchen table. I thought about Mrs. Henderson. Margaret Paston. I read about her specifically, a woman in 15th century England whose husband spent much of their marriage away on legal and political business or confined in prison by enemies, and whose letters document in extraordinary detail what she did in his absence. She bought materials. She managed the estate accounts. She directed the servants. She negotiated with hostile neighbours. When one of their properties was seized by an armed force and her husband's representative was thrown out, she wrote him a meticulous account of what had happened and what she was doing about it, and then she did it. She was not panicking. She was not passive. She was, in the phrasing I would have used in Ohio in 1944, getting on with it. The Paston letters exist in the British Library now, hundreds of them covering 40 years. They are the most complete record we have of what a medieval household actually looked like from the inside, and they show a woman running things, not waiting for a man to come back and run them, running them herself in his absence, with a thoroughness that kept the family's holdings intact and their children provided for and their position maintained. I think of this every time I hear waiting used to describe what women did while men went to war, in the Pacific, at Gettysburg, in the 100 Years' War, in the Crusades, in whatever war you name. They were not waiting, they were keeping the world from falling apart. The distinction matters. I should tell you about the air raid drills at school. Once a month a whistle sounded and we went under our desks. A drill that would have provided essentially no protection against an actual air raid, but that served an important psychological function, which was to give children the feeling that there was something they could do. Useful action, even symbolic useful action, is better than pure helplessness. We understood this instinctively as children. We tucked ourselves under our desks with a kind of purposeful satisfaction that was not frightened and not foolish, but something else, something I would call cooperative. We bought war bonds at school. Every Monday morning we brought in our dimes and quarters and they were added up and recorded, and when you had accumulated $18.75, you had purchased a bond that would be worth $25 in 10 years. The arithmetic of patriotism made concrete and manageable for children. I saved for 8 months to buy my first bond, and I kept the certificate in my desk at school and brought it home at the end of the year, and my mother put it in the tin box with Thomas's letters. My father drove the truck less. Gasoline was rationed, and what he had he needed for the farm work, so we went to town less, and the county road outside our house was quieter than it had ever been. There was a particular quality to that wartime quiet. It was not restful quiet, not peaceful quiet, but a held-breath quiet, the quiet of a community that knew it was waiting for something and was trying to be good at waiting. I also want to tell you about the women who took work in those years. In Millbrook and the next town over, a small factory that had made farm equipment parts retooled for the war effort, and women who had not worked outside the home before went to work there. Not because the war gave them permission, that is the myth, that the war freed women for the first time to work. Women had always worked. But the war created a cultural context in which certain kinds of women's work that required skill and responsibility and physical capability, were acknowledged as necessary, were paid, were recognized. The women I watched do this, neighbors, women from church, older cousins, did not seem transformed by it or liberated in any dramatic sense. They seemed to add this work to what they were already doing because that is what was necessary. And when the war ended, some of them gave it up and some of them didn't, and the ones who didn't fought to keep it. And the ones who did found themselves with skills and a knowledge of their own capacity that did not go away when the factory retooled back to peacetime production. Thomas came home in the fall of 1945. He was 21. He came back on a bus from the city and my father drove the truck to the station to get him, and they came up the county road in the evening with the truck lights on, and my mother stood in the front doorway in her good dress and her good apron, the apron because she had been cooking and the dress because he was coming home. And Dorothy and I were at the edge of the porch and the truck stopped and Thomas got out. He was the same person. He was a different person. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and I did not fully understand the second until later. He was home. The radio in the living room played something, I don't remember what, something ordinary, and the evening settled into the house around us like a deep breath finally released. We had kept it together, all of it, the farm, the household, the family. While he was away, and while the country was at war, my mother and my father and Dorothy and I had kept everything that needed keeping. The crops had come in, the animals had been fed, the canning had been done, the bills had been paid, the lamp had been on. Not waiting, continuing, there is a considerable difference. And if you have been wondering how this connects to what I said at the beginning about medieval women, about the Chatelaines and the Paston letters and the romantic myth of the waiting woman, there it is. The connection is simply this. Nothing has changed. Not in 500 years. Not in 900. The women left behind have always continued. They have managed and planted and negotiated and kept accounts and defended what needed defending and fed what needed feeding and sat in the evenings with the lamp on, reading letters, folding them carefully, putting them away in the tin box that held the things that had to be kept. That is the history that does not get written, but some of us carry it anyway. The post-war years had a particular quality that I do not think any subsequent American era has quite replicated. There was an expansion in them, not just economic though that too, but a kind of loosening of the held breath quality that had characterized the war years. Things were possible again, things you had not let yourself think about. I was 14 in 1945, 15 by the end of that year. At 14, I was still very much inside my family's world. The farm, the school, the church, the county. By 17, I had begun to feel the edges of that world as edges. Not uncomfortable, not distressing, but present in a way they had not been before. The world past the county road was large, and I was becoming curious about it in a specific, personal way, which is the way you know adolescence is actually happening. The boys who came back were not quite the same as the boys who had left. Thomas was the one I observed most closely, naturally, because he was my brother and he was home. He was quieter than he had been. He laughed less readily, and when he laughed, it was a shorter laugh than before. He was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to make this sound darker than it was. He was simply different in his manner, the way a person is different who has seen things they have absorbed and not entirely processed, and who has learned to be economical with himself in a way that a young man who has not been to war does not need to be. He went to work on the farm with my father and did not seem to want to leave Millbrook right away, though later he would when a friend from the service offered him a job in Dayton. For those first years he was home, and home was enough. I met Robert at a church social in the spring of 1948. I was 17. He was 22, which then seemed entirely appropriate and now seems almost identical in age. He had come back from the Navy, not the Pacific. He had been stationed in Virginia and had not seen combat, which he mentioned with a slight embarrassment that I found touching, as if the war had not been hard enough simply in the being there, in the uncertainty, in the years taken from ordinary life. He was not a handsome man in any obvious way. He had good hands, working hands, square and capable, and a face that looked honest, which it was. He was from a farm family in the next county, one of 4 boys, and he had the quality of someone who had grown up in a house full of people and had learned through that upbringing to take up less space than was technically available to him. We walked together after the social. It was an April evening, the kind that comes sometimes in Ohio in April, when the warmth seems miraculous after the length of winter, and you walk slightly slower than you need to because the air itself feels worth savoring. He asked about my family, I asked about his. We talked about farming, which is what you talked about in those circles, in those years. He asked if he could walk with me to church the following Sunday. I said he could. Courtship, then, was not elaborate. We did not go to restaurants or movie theatres with any regularity because restaurants and movie theatres cost money, and money was still something that was spent with attention. We walked. We sat on the porch with my parents in the evenings, which was the acceptable arrangement in those years, because the acceptable arrangement was that you were not alone together unsupervised, which now sounds formal and then simply felt like the shape of things. My mother made coffee and my father asked Robert his opinions on various topics, crops, the new administration, the price of corn, and Robert answered carefully and my father listened and formed conclusions. My father approved of Robert. This was communicated not through statement, but through the way he stopped leaving the porch when Robert came to call, which he had done with the one previous young man, sitting inside pointedly and letting my mother handle the supervision. With Robert, he stayed. That was the approval. I want to tell you what marriage was in those years because I think it may be genuinely different from what it is now, and the difference is worth understanding. It was not primarily a romantic arrangement, or rather, it was that secondarily. It was primarily a practical partnership, a joining of 2 households, 2 sets of skills, 2 people's labor in the direction of making a life that neither could make alone. The romance was real. I do not want to minimize it, because I loved Robert, and I know that he loved me, and that love was the substance of our life together, but it coexisted with a very clear understanding that love alone does not plant a garden or pay a bill or keep a house warm in January. We married in the spring of 1950. I was 19. The wedding was at my family's church in Millbrook, a morning service in May, and my mother made my dress from a length of ivory cotton that she and Dorothy and I spent 3 evenings cutting and sewing at the kitchen table. It was a beautiful dress. I know that people say that about their wedding dresses regardless of the truth, but I say it because it was true. She had a gift, my mother, with cloth and thread, and she put everything she had into that dress. Thomas walked me down the aisle. My father sat in the front pew and watched with an expression that was the most complex thing I had ever seen on his face. Pride, I think, and something close to sorrow, not because he disapproved, but because he understood that something was ending as well as beginning, which is the double nature of ceremonies that mark transitions. We moved into a house in Madison, a small town about 15 miles from the farm, because Robert had found work there at the hardware store and later would buy into ownership of it. The house was rented, 2 bedrooms, with a proper kitchen and a bathroom inside and a furnace in the basement that meant we were warm in January without the deliberate effort that warmth had always required before. I remember the first morning in that house. Robert had left for work, and I was alone in the kitchen, and I stood there for a moment looking at it. My kitchen now, my particular arrangement of things, my window looking out on my yard, the simple domesticity of it, the fact of it being mine. I had Tupperware in my cabinets. This sounds like a small thing. It was, in the context of my childhood, a rather astonishing thing. Plastic containers with lids that sealed. No more cloth over the bowl. No more plates balanced on top of pots. No more guessing whether the cold enough to keep things in the back of the pantry would actually be cold enough. The post-war world was full of small marvels like this. Materials and technologies and products that addressed inconveniences that people had simply lived with for generations. You adjusted, and you were grateful, and then within a year you could not imagine how you had managed without it. Robert was a steady man, not exciting. I do not say that as criticism, I say it as simple description. He was not given to dramatic gestures or elaborate plans or sweeping enthusiasms. He came home at a regular hour. He did what he said he would do. He kept his word. He was kind to my parents and eventually to his own, and he was reliable in the way that a good tool is reliable. You could depend on him for the thing he was made for, and what he was made for was being a steady, decent, consistent presence in a life. We were happy. Not the happiness of films, not the happiness of stories where everything resolves in a particular decisive moment. The quieter happiness of people who have found the arrangement that works and are not in the habit of dramatizing it. We were happy in the way of 2 people who eat breakfast together every morning for 40 years and find that the company continues to suit. There was something I noticed about those early years of marriage, something I noticed but could not have named at the time. I was running a household. The full weight of that particular word, running, is what I mean. I kept the accounts. I managed the budget. I negotiated with the milkman, the insurance man, the woman from whom I bought eggs when the particular circumstances of our life did not allow keeping our own chickens. I made decisions all day, every day, that kept the household functioning. Robert worked. I managed. And the managing was not less than the working. It was simply different work and invisible in the way that domestic work has always been invisible, which is to say that it was noticed only when it was not done. I thought about that too, years later, when I read about Margaret Paston. She managed an estate. I managed a house. The scale was different. The principle was the same. But I was 20, and I did not think in terms of principles at 20. I thought in terms of what needed doing, and I did it. In those first years, there was a wringer washer in the basement. Monday mornings, I ran the laundry through it, feeding the wet clothes into the rollers with a focus that required full attention because the rollers did not distinguish between a shirt and a hand, and you developed a caution about them early in your acquaintance. The clothes came out flat and damp, and I hung them on the line in the backyard if the weather permitted, in the basement on a string of wire if it did not. The smell of sheets dried on a line in a summer wind is something I would not know how to describe to someone who has not experienced it. Clean does not cover it. It is some specific outdoor sun and wind variety of clean that has no other name. Robert bought a proper washing machine in 1955 when the business was going well enough to allow it. I received this with the gratitude appropriate to the occasion and thought about my mother and her washboard in the lean-to kitchen and felt that things had in fact improved. The thing about marriage that I want to tell you, that I did not know at the beginning and understood better as the years went on, is that it is made daily, not once. The ceremony makes it legal. The daily choices make it real. You choose every morning to be in this particular arrangement, with this particular person, tending this particular life. Not dramatically, just by continuing, by getting up and making breakfast and going about the ordinary day and coming back to it at night. 44 years of mornings. That is what our marriage was. Some of them were better than others, of course. Some were difficult. Some were the mornings of grief or illness or disagreement or the specific strain of close proximity over a long time. But most of them were simply mornings, ordinary, unexceptional, entirely adequate mornings, and in the aggregate, they were everything. Robert said so once, not romantically, not as a tribute, but as a simple statement of fact. "You know how to run things," he said one evening toward the end of a particularly complex week, with an expression of uncomplicated admiration that was, from him, as close to a formal declaration as you were likely to get. I accepted it in the spirit in which it was offered. And I thought, yes, I do. I learned it from my mother, who learned it from hers, who learned it from the generations before her, all the way back to the women who managed farms and households and their families through seasons I cannot imagine, through hardships that make mine look simple, through wars and plagues and harvests and all the ordinary emergencies of a long human story. The knowledge of how to run things passes from woman to woman through the example of daily life, through the morning in the kitchen and the account book in the drawer and the lamp that stays on and the family that holds together because someone is holding it. I am glad I knew how. I am glad she taught me. The first car Robert and I owned together was a 1948 Ford in a shade of green that he called sage, and I called grey-green, and we never agreed on. He bought it from a man in the next county for $300 in the spring of 1951, a purchase that required genuine deliberation and that he made with the expression of a man undertaking something significant, which he was. We drove it to my parents' farm on the Sunday after we bought it, and my father walked around it twice without saying anything and then nodded, which was the approval. I should tell you something about those early years of marriage that I think is true, but that is difficult to say without sounding different from what I mean. The domesticity of it, the setting up of a household, the making of a home, was not a small thing to me. I know that some women of my generation found it constraining, and I understand that, and I do not want to minimize it. But for me, coming from the farmhouse in the Depression years, having a house that was mine to arrange, a kitchen that was mine to organize, a garden that was mine to plant, this was not confinement. It was a form of authority. Small authority, domestic authority, but mine. My daughter Margaret was born in the spring of 1952. Margaret, because I had been thinking about names for months, and had come back again and again to that name, strong and plain and good, the name of women who managed, who stayed, who kept things going. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, and by Tuesday evening I was in the bed in the hospital room in Madison, feeling a combination of exhaustion and astonishment that I do not think any subsequent experience in my life has come near to matching. She was 8 pounds, 2 ounces. She had Robert's hands, those square, capable hands, and my mother's expression, which was a look of appraising calm, the look of someone who has just arrived somewhere and is assessing the situation before deciding what to do about it. She has worn that expression for 72 years now, and it still suits her. My son James came 3 years later, in 1955, summer, and where Margaret had arrived with that calm assessment, James arrived with a considerable opinion about the process, which he communicated at high volume, and which prepared me, I think, reasonably well for the person he would turn out to be. Loud, affectionate, interested in everything, restless with settled arrangements. The years from Margaret's birth to James's adolescence are what I think of when people say the phrase, my life. Not that the years before or after weren't my life, they were. But those particular years are the ones that feel most densely inhabited, most fully lived in every hour of them. The years of young children are like that. They require everything, and they give back something proportionate to what they take. Our house in Madison was 3 rooms downstairs and 2 bedrooms up, and for several years it was exactly the right size, and then it was exactly the wrong size, and then we adjusted and it became acceptable again. Children do not require space so much as they require attention, and attention I gave in quantities that would have alarmed my younger self, who would have said she was not naturally patient. It turns out you become patient because you have to, which is more reliable than becoming patient because of character. Character is variable, necessity is consistent. The days had a rhythm, I want to describe the rhythm because the rhythm was the thing. It was what held everything together, what made the ordinary days add up to something more than their individual components. 6 o'clock. Robert up and dressed, downstairs for coffee, out the door by 6:30. I heard him always on some level of consciousness, even in sleep. The sounds of his morning had become part of my inner landscape. The particular creak of the third step, the sound of the percolator, the truck starting in the driveway. 6:30. Margaret awake, because she was always awake early, a quality she was born with and has never lost. She would lie in her bed for a few minutes being quietly awake, which I know because I sometimes stood in the doorway and watched, and then she would get up with decision. 7. James awake, noisily. The morning established itself. Breakfast, oatmeal in winter, toast and eggs in summer, always orange juice from the tin can that had seemed like a miracle to me the first time I saw it in the grocery store, and that I bought every week without the cost now seeming remarkable, because miracles normalize quickly. Orange juice, every morning. My children grew up expecting it. This struck me as evidence of a kind of progress. I walked Margaret to school, then James, when James began. The school was 6 blocks from the house, and the walk was long enough to be a walk and short enough to be every day, and I used it, as time to talk. Not about important things, necessarily, about what was going to happen that day, what she was learning, what he was worried about, the small maintenance of knowing what is happening in your children's interior lives, which requires daily attention or it becomes inaccessible. I came home and cleaned. I will not pretend this was interesting because it was not interesting. Cleaning is not interesting. It is necessary, and there is a satisfaction in the result that is real, but the activity itself is maintenance, and maintenance is distinguished from creativity in that it produces not something new but the continuation of something existing. I maintained every day because a house with small children requires it, and because I had been taught by my mother that the discipline of the maintained household was itself a form of respect for the family, for the space, for the ordinary life that deserved to be well kept. And then I did what I loved. I gardened. We had a backyard that was not large, and that I had gradually claimed for a garden over the first years we lived there. Not a victory garden this time, not necessity, but what I thought of as a pleasure garden, though it also produced food, because the habits of economy do not die just because the economics improve. Tomatoes, always tomatoes. Sweet peas along the back fence because I had my mother's understanding of beauty as a category of necessity. Zinnias, which are sturdy and undemanding and come in colours that seem too saturated to be real. The women in our neighbourhood were a community. I want to say something about this because I think it is underappreciated now. The degree to which the post-war American neighbourhood was a functioning social structure, particularly for women. We were all more or less home, more or less the same age, more or less at the same stage of life, and we moved freely between houses in a way that required no appointment or invitation, because the doors were open and the coffee was on. Mrs. Kowalski next door had 4 children and made pierogi from scratch every Friday and sometimes gave us a plate over the fence. Mrs. Draper across the street had a garden that rivaled mine, and we traded seeds and cuttings and opinions about roses with a seriousness that would have surprised anyone who did not understand that gardens are the kind of thing that matter. Mrs. Sorrento at the corner knew everything about what was happening in the neighbourhood before it happened, which was a gift of either unusual perception or unusual access to information, and I was never entirely sure which. We watched each other's children when watching was needed. We sat with each other when sitting was needed. When Mrs. Kowalski's husband was in the hospital for a week, we brought food every evening. A rotation, organised without discussion, because organisation was what we did. When Margaret broke her arm falling out of the oak tree in the backyard, it was Mrs. Draper who heard her cry and came over the fence before I had gotten down the back steps. This is what community looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, not exceptional, just present, consistently, reliably present. Robert came home in the evenings and we ate dinner at the kitchen table, the 4 of us later, but for a while just the 3 of us before James, and I liked that particular configuration, Margaret between us like the point of a triangle, chattering about school with the inexhaustible informational productivity of a bright 6-year-old. Robert asking questions that were not just polite but genuinely interested because he was good with children in the way that some people simply are, able to enter the scale of their concerns without condescension. There is a particular television memory I have. We got our first television set in 1956, a black and white set with a round screen in a wooden cabinet that Robert brought home on a Saturday afternoon with the air of a man who has been thinking about this for months and has decided. The children watched it with an intensity that I found both amusing and slightly alarming. The programming was not remarkable. Variety shows, westerns, a cartoon on Saturday mornings that James watched lying on the floor with his chin in his hands and his whole small body oriented toward the screen. The night they played I Love Lucy, Margaret and I sat on the couch together, and I laughed, really laughed, in a way I had not done in a while, which I noticed, and which I thought about later. How laughter is like water. You forget you need it until you have it again, and then you notice the not having. In the summer of 1957, we watched the news about Sputnik on that black and white television screen, and James, who was 2 years old, was not interested, and Margaret, who was 5, was very interested and asked questions I could not fully answer, and Robert said, into the middle of all of it, that the world had changed today. He said it quietly and without drama, in the manner of a man who tends to say true things plainly, and he was right. The summers of those years. I want to tell you about the summers of those years. Long evenings, the light going on past 9 o'clock, the children in the backyard, long past when they should have been in bed, and Robert and I on the back steps with iced tea and the particular contentment of a summer evening in Ohio, which is different from other contentments, but is its own genuine thing. The sound of the neighborhood at evening, radios through open windows, children called home by name across yards, the slow cooling of the air after the heat of the day, the fireflies. We always let the fireflies go. I had taught them what my mother taught me. You catch them for the catching, then you let them go. There is something I want to tell you about that period that I didn't understand at the time and have thought about since. I was very busy. I was busy in every hour of every day with the maintenance of the household and the raising of the children and the ordinary business of a life with 2 young people in it. And in the middle of that busyness, there was a kind of happiness that I did not recognize as happiness while I was inside it, because happiness, when you are busy enough, is simply the quality of the hours you are living rather than a feeling you stop to notice. I notice it now. Looking back from 93 at those ordinary Tuesdays and Thursdays, I can feel them differently than I could feel them then. Not better, but more clearly. The accumulation of them. The way they were quietly building something that would turn out to matter very much. Margaret's face at 6, James's laugh at 3, the weight of them when they fell asleep in the car and had to be carried in, the smell of a child's head in the morning, the particular quality of being needed in that total physical way, needed to get up, needed to be present, needed to feed and comfort and keep safe. That is exhausting while it is happening and becomes, in retrospect, one of the more profound experiences available. I am glad of it, all of it, the ordinary, particular, beautiful days. There were years in the middle of raising the children when I did not have much time that was clearly mine, and I want to be honest about that because I think the retrospective account of motherhood often smooths over it. The days were long and the nights were interrupted and the demands were constant, and I was tired in a way that I have not been since, and that required a particular kind of management, not the management of money or household, but the management of oneself, the daily negotiation with one's own fatigue and impatience and the legitimate desire for 5 minutes of quiet. What helped in those years was the women, the Mrs. Kowalskis and the Mrs. Drapers, the telephone and the coffee over the fence and the informal knowledge that you were not doing this alone, that someone 3 houses down was at the same point in the same day and would understand exactly what you meant without having to explain it. The community of mothers is one of the great under-acknowledged institutions of human civilization. It has no formal name. It is held together by nothing except common experience and proximity and the particular solidarity of people who are each other's best witnesses. I want to tell you about the television in more detail because it was a genuine shift in how we understood ourselves as a family and a community. Before the television, our evenings had been filled with the radio and with conversation and with whatever projects my mother, and later I, had in our hands. Mending, letter writing, the everyday business of a household continuing its maintenance. After the television, the evenings organized themselves differently around the schedule of programming, which was a genuinely new thing. We were no longer setting the pace of the evening. Something external was. I noticed this, but did not object to it, because the television also gave us things we had not had before. News of the world, more immediate and vivid than the newspaper. The shared experience of watching something together in the dark of the living room, which had its own quality, quieter than conversation, more companionable than solitude. And when it was very good, when something on the television was genuinely excellent, genuinely important, the feeling of being part of something larger than the living room, connected through the screen to millions of other people watching the same thing at the same moment. Margaret remembers watching the Apollo 11 moon landing in July of 1969. She was 17. She sat on the floor in front of the television with James beside her, and we watched the grainy image from the moon and heard the voice from 340,000 miles away. And I felt something I have felt very rarely in my life. The sense of being present at something that would be permanent, that would be in the record forever, that future people would look back at and say, that is when. If you are still with me, I am glad. Let yourself drift if you need to. I will be here, the lamp will be on. And if you would rather have my voice in your ear without the screen, the full library of evenings like this one is on Spotify now. The link is in the description below or pinned in the first comment. Find me there whenever the night feels long. There is a decade of life. I would put mine roughly between 1962 and 1972, when you look around and notice that things have settled. The children are in school, past the years of total physical dependence. The house is known and manageable. The marriage has become itself, not the project it was at the beginning when you were building it, but the established fact of it, the thing you live inside without thinking about the living. The work is steady. I should tell you about work, my work, I mean, because by this time I had begun to do something outside the house. In 1963, when James started high school and Margaret was in her last year, I took a job at the hardware store. Robert's store, our store by then, he had bought out his partner the previous year. I started doing the bookkeeping because Robert's strengths lay in the merchandise and the customers and not in the columns of numbers, and mine lay in the columns of numbers and always had. I had kept our household accounts since the first month of our marriage, with a precision that came from my mother and from the Depression years, and I turned out to be good at a larger version of the same work. I was 32. I had not worked outside the house since before Margaret was born. The adjustment was not adjustment exactly. It felt like coming home to a part of myself that had been waiting. The job was part-time at first, 3 mornings a week, then 4, then full mornings every day. I had a desk in the back of the store next to Robert's desk, which was considerably less orderly than mine, and I brought sense to his invoices and his payables and his inventory in a way that he told me more than once had changed things. "You see the numbers," he said. "I just see the merchandise." This was true, and it was the beginning of an understanding between us that I think deepened the marriage. When you discover an area in which you are genuinely more capable than your husband, and he discovers it at the same time, and neither of you finds this threatening, that is a sign of something. A sign of either security or mutual respect or both. We did not talk about it in those terms. We simply worked alongside each other, and the work went better than it had before. The 1960s arrived in a small Ohio town with a time delay. The things that were happening elsewhere, the civil rights movement, the protests, the changes in style and music and manner, arrived first through the television and the radio, and then gradually through the children who came home from school with new ideas that they had encountered from sources I could not trace. Margaret went to college in 1970, the Ohio State University, on a partial scholarship that she had earned and that we supplemented, and I drove her there in September and helped her move into the dormitory room she would share with a girl from Cleveland. And I said goodbye on the sidewalk outside the dormitory with the particular steadiness of a mother who has understood for some years that the point of raising a child is to make them capable of leaving. I cried on the way home. Robert drove. I sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the Ohio highway and cried, not from sadness exactly, but from the fullness of it, the fact that she was going and going well, and that going well was the goal. And the goal had been achieved, and somehow achieving the goal felt almost as much like loss as like triumph. Both at once. That is the honest account. James was 17 when Margaret left and showed no immediate interest in college, which worried Robert more than it worried me. James had always been the one who wanted to understand how things worked rather than what they meant, which is a different kind of intelligence and leads somewhere different. He ended up in a trade of electrical work which suited him precisely, which suited his hands and his spatial sense and his need to see a problem and solve it and move on. He started his own business in Columbus by the time he was 30 and has run it successfully ever since, which I find satisfying in a way I have never quite been able to articulate, except to say that a child doing the thing they were made for is among the more complete pleasures available to a parent. There was a summer, I think it was 1968, when I understood something I hadn't before. Robert had a health scare that summer. His heart did something it shouldn't do, nothing catastrophic, but something that required a few days in the hospital and a conversation with the doctor that came home with him in his face and stayed there for a while. He was 53. I was 37. The children were teenagers. I managed the store by myself for 3 weeks while he recovered. I ran it. I ordered the stock, dealt with the suppliers, handled the accounts, dealt with the one difficult employee who assumed apparently that a woman filling in for her husband would be easier to manage than the husband. He was mistaken and discovered this on the third day. Pleasantly, but without ambiguity. I was not frightened by the management. That is what I understood that summer. I was worried about Robert's health, which is different. But the management itself, the running of things, felt familiar, felt like what I did. I had been running things all along, in the domestic sphere, in the store's bookkeeping. This was just more of the same, on a larger scale. I thought about my mother in the Depression years. I thought about Mrs. Henderson on the county road. I thought, though I had not yet read about her, about the medieval women I would learn about decades later, the ones who kept the estates running when the Lord was away and about whom history had said she was waiting. Robert recovered. He changed some things after that, ate better, rested more, stopped carrying the particular tension in his shoulders that I now understood I had been watching for years without registering it as such. He was quieter in his pleasures after that, more deliberate about the things he chose to do and the ones he let go of. In 1971, I began attending a class at the county extension office, business accounting, not because I needed the credential, but because I wanted to understand the formal version of what I had been doing by instinct and because a formal understanding seemed worth having. I was 40 years old. I was the oldest person in the class by about 10 years. I finished it first. The teacher said I should consider taking more courses. I said I would think about it, and I did think about it, and then I thought about all the things that were happening at home and decided against it for that particular moment, with the understanding that the moment was not permanent, and neither was the decision. This is how women have always navigated the competing claims on their time, with the understanding that decisions made in the present are not eternal, that the thing you are putting off is not necessarily being given up, that patience and delay are not the same thing. The children grew. Margaret married a man named Paul who was steady in the Robert way and good in the ways that mattered. James moved to Columbus and started his electrical business and called on Sundays in the manner of a person who does not naturally think to call but has made himself a rule about it, and the rule was reliable. The Sundays were reliable. By the time the 1970s were ending, I was looking at something that felt like the horizon of the life I had built. The children were launched. The store was well, Robert was well, the house was known and comfortable. October evenings on the back porch with Robert, looking at the garden going brown and the light going low, and the particular satisfaction of a life that had been built deliberately and had held. There is a bicentennial memory I have from 1976 that I want to tell you. We watched the celebrations on television, the tall ships in the harbour, the fireworks, the particular national self-congratulation that a 200th birthday requires. Robert sat in his chair and watched with the expression he got when watching things he considered both worthy and slightly overwrought. I sat with him and watched. We were 45, the country was 200, and we had been in Ohio for all of our lives and were unlikely to go elsewhere. I thought about what 200 years contained, what the country had been when it was founded and what it had become, the women in it through all of it, the ones who had waited, which is to say the ones who had continued through every generation of the Republic, keeping the households and the children and the enterprises running while the history was being made in places that got written down. It struck me that night that the not getting written down was itself a kind of record, that the absence in the historical account was the shape of what had been there. You could read the history of a nation in what it neglected to include, and what it had most consistently neglected to include was the daily work of women, which did not stop because there was a war or an election or a depression mourn, which continued in fact precisely because there was and because something had to. Robert went to bed and I stayed up a little longer, watching the last of the fireworks on the television screen, and I thought, yes, we have been here all along, every generation of us, keeping things. I am not going to pretend those years were without difficulty. Every life has difficulty. I'm saying that the difficulty was manageable, and what was manageable did not feel like crisis, and I had always lived with enough difficulty to understand the difference between crisis and inconvenience. The fireflies came again in the summers, and the children's children came to visit, and we let the fireflies go, and the evenings settled in around us, amber and warm and full of the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood doing what neighborhoods do. Let yourself rest here for a moment if you need to. I am not hurrying. The night is long, and so is the story. There was a friendship I want to tell you about that mattered through this period. A woman named Clara who worked at the library in Madison and who I met at a church committee meeting in the early 1960s. She was a different kind of woman from most of the women I knew. She had gone to college, she had lived in 2 other cities before coming to Madison. She had opinions about books and politics and art that were more developed than most of the opinions I encountered. She was not loud about it, but she was genuine about it, which was enough. We met for coffee once a week, on Thursday mornings, for nearly 20 years. We talked about everything. Books, always. She was the one who pointed me toward the social history that I would read properly in my 70s, gave me the first volume years before I was ready for the whole of it. She talked about the world with a seriousness that I found, in those years of domestic routines and hardware store accounts, deeply refreshing. She died in 1981. The same year my mother died, and I have missed them both every year since, in different ways and for different reasons. The Red Cross work I did in those years. I should mention it because it was important to me, and I have not said enough about it. I volunteered with the local chapter through most of the 1960s, not the dramatic disaster response work, but the quieter organizational work, blood drives, first aid training, the coordination of what needed coordinating. It was work that used the same skills as the hardware store bookkeeping, the same capacity for organizing systems and keeping records and making sure the right thing got to the right place. I liked the usefulness of it. I liked that it was larger than our household. The question of what a woman's life is for, beyond her family, I want to address that directly for a moment, because I think it is something that people of my generation were not always encouraged to ask. I was 40, 50 years old before I thought about it with any clarity. The answer I arrived at was simple and perhaps obvious. A woman's life is for the same things a man's life is for doing work that matters, for being useful, for learning and growing and contributing something. The specific form this takes is shaped by circumstance, by obligation, by what is available and what is required. But the larger purpose is the same. My mother died in 1981. She was 78 years old. She had been slowing for 2 years, a gradual softening of the clarity that had always been her sharpest quality, the organized competence going first around the edges and then toward the center. She was in the farmhouse until the last 6 months, when she came to live with Dorothy and Dorothy's husband, because Dorothy lived closest and because Dorothy had my mother's quality of practical management and knew how to apply it to the specific problem of caring for an aging parent. My father had gone 2 years before, quickly, the way quiet men sometimes go, in his sleep one November night, without requiring anyone to manage the process for him. He had gone out to check the barn, come back in, gone to bed, and that was that. My mother said she heard him settle, heard him still, and knew. She said it with the same matter-of-fact quality with which she said most things, which did not mean she was not devastated. It meant she was my mother. I want to tell you about grief without being grandiose about it, because grief is grandiose enough on its own and does not need assistance. What I can tell you is that it is not what you expect, even if you have expected it, even if you have had time to prepare. The actual experience of loss when it arrives is both more ordinary and more absolute than the anticipation suggested. When my father died, the grief was held at a certain distance by the practical necessities of what had to be done, and by the fact that I still had my mother, and by the fact that he had died in the manner he would have chosen and had not suffered. These were real consolations. They did not eliminate the loss, but they gave it a shape you could carry. When my mother died, the grief was different. The loss of the last parent is different in kind, not just degree. You become, in a particular way, the top of the stack. There is no one above you anymore. No one who remembers you before you could remember yourself. No one for whom you are primarily a child. That absence has a specific gravity to it that I had not expected and that required some time to adjust to. She was buried in the same cemetery in Millbrook where her parents were buried and where my father already was, and where I will go eventually myself, which is a comforting thought and not a morbid one. The continuity of it, the fact that the places we love can hold the ones we have loved, can keep them located in the world we continue to inhabit. Robert retired from the store in 1988. We sold it to a good buyer, a young couple who were better suited than Robert and I would have been to the changing retail landscape of the late 80s. The hardware store had been the center of his working life for 35 years. He was not someone who dramatized transitions, but I watched him on the day we handed over the keys, and I understood that something was ending for him, the way it ends when a thing you have been has ceased to be the thing you are. He found his way. He took up woodworking. We had a garage that had always had a workbench in it, and he made it into a proper workshop over the winter of that first year of retirement, and he spent mornings in there making things with the same quiet attention he had given to the store. Furniture, small pieces at first, then larger, a cabinet for Margaret's kitchen that she still has, a bed frame for James's eldest child, who has now had it for 25 years. The making of things is a form of continuity. I understand that now in a way I could not have articulated then. Robert died on a Friday in March of 1994. He was 71 years old. It was not sudden and it was not prolonged. About 6 months from the diagnosis to the end, which was enough time to say everything that needed saying, and not so much time that the saying was the only thing left to do. We said what we needed to say. I sat with him. I am not going to tell you the details of those 6 months. They belong to him, and they belong to Margaret and James, and to the space between us that was ours alone. What I will tell you is that he died as he had lived, quietly, without complaint, with the dignity of a man who had decided long ago what kind of person he was going to be, and had simply remained that person until the end. The house was very quiet afterward. This sounds obvious, and it is, but the quality of the quiet is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it, not peaceful quiet, not empty quiet exactly, a particular silence that comes from the absence of a specific person, not silence in general, but the silence left by one voice, one set of footsteps, one particular way of being present in rooms. I learned that grief is not a single thing. It is a collection of things, and they arrive on different schedules, and some of them arrive long after you thought you had finished. 3 months after Robert died, I found a note he had written to himself about a birthday present he was going to get me, written on a piece of hardware store notepad paper in his handwriting, and I sat down in the kitchen and cried for the first time with real abandon, because the note was so him, careful, practical, a list rather than a sentiment, and because it came from a future that had not arrived and now would not. I kept going. I should say how, because keeping going is not automatic. You keep going by doing the next thing. You make breakfast. You answer the telephone. You go to church on Sunday because the church is full of people who knew you before and during and will know you after, and there is something in that continuity that is not nothing. You go to Margaret's for dinner on Tuesdays because she has arranged it and does not want you to feel alone, and you are grateful for the arrangement even when you are not in the mood for it, because mood is variable and arrangement is reliable. Dorothy called every morning. Every morning of those first years my phone rang at 8 o'clock and it was Dorothy. We had not lived in the same house since 1950, and we had talked through every phase of our lives, and we knew each other with the particular knowledge that only people who shared a cornhusk mattress at 6 years old can have. And in the year after Robert died, she called every morning, and we talked for 15 minutes about whatever came to mind. And I do not know whether I told her at the time how much it meant, but I know it now. The medievalists I would later read had a term for what Dorothy was doing. Mutual aid, not in the economic sense, but in the simpler sense of people providing for each other the things that cannot be bought. Presence, consistency, the morning call, the Tuesday dinner, the keeping of someone in the frame of daily life so they do not drift out of it. I was 63 years old when Robert died. I had lived more than half of my life with him beside me, and I had another 30 years to live without him, and I want to tell you clearly, I lived them. Not heroically, not with extraordinary grace, but the way you live the hard parts of a life, by continuing, by finding what continues to give pleasure, by allowing yourself to be sustained by the people who want to sustain you. The garden, the books, Dorothy's morning calls, Margaret's Tuesday dinners, James's Sunday phone calls, reliable as rules. These are the things. these are the things that kept me. There is something about this I want to say plainly because I think it is important. Loss does not make you strong. Or rather, the strength you show in grief is not created by the grief. It was already there, laid down over all the preceding years, by the depression and the war years, and the years of children and the running of things and the daily ordinary work of a long life. When loss comes, it does not build the house. It reveals what the house was built of, and if you have been building it of the right things, it holds. I had been building with the right things. My mother showed me how. There were friends who died in those years. I want to say something about this because it is the under-acknowledged cost of long life, the losing. Clara, in 1981. A neighbor named Helen, who had been part of my life in Madison for 30 years and who died of cancer in 1986 at 61, which seems younger to me every year. Mrs. Kowalski, she had been in a care home for several years and then was not anymore, and I felt the loss of her with a sharpness that surprised me because by then we had not been close for decades. But she had been part of the neighborhood of my young motherhood, and losing her was losing another piece of that time. The accumulation of loss is one of the things nobody tells you about getting old, or tells you in a way that registers before you are inside it. Each loss individually is manageable. It is the accumulation that has a different quality. The way the circle grows smaller over the years, the way the number of people who share your specific memories diminishes, the way you become increasingly the keeper of a record that fewer and fewer people can verify or add to. Dorothy has been, through this, my most important companion. I want to say this clearly. Dorothy has been irreplaceable, not because she is my sister. Family does not automatically mean this kind of closeness, but because we have chosen to be close, have maintained the closeness through geography and life stage and all the things that pull people apart, and have found in each other a consistency of understanding that I do not have with anyone else alive. She knows what the farmhouse smelled like in winter. She knows what our mother's expression looked like when she closed the account book. She was there for all of it, and she is still there, calling at 8 o'clock every morning, and I cannot tell you what that is worth because the number is too large. I want to tell you something about the grief of losing Robert that I have not said yet, something I understood only in the years after. I had been, throughout our marriage, the person who ran things. Not exclusively. Robert ran the store. Robert managed the finances in certain ways, but in the domestic sphere, in the management of our household and our family's daily life, I was the organizer, the planner, the keeper of the systems. When he died, I expected to miss him. I did miss him terribly, in ways I have already tried to describe. What I did not expect was to miss being witnessed, to miss having someone who saw daily what I was doing, not to praise it, he was not given to praise, but simply to know it, to be present while I organized the Tuesday dinner, or called the plumber, or planned the garden, or kept the accounts. The witness of a domestic life is almost entirely invisible in most people's understanding of intimacy, but I found, in his absence, that it was one of the things I had valued most about being married. Someone who knew what you did and what it cost and did not need to be told. After Robert died, I found that the doing was not difficult. I had been doing it all along. What was different was the quality of the hours. They had weight in a way they had not had before, a kind of settled attention. Not heavier exactly, but differently substantial, as if I had become more present to my own life and also more aware of its edges. There is something about getting old that nobody warns you about, or if they warn you about it, you do not hear it until you are there and can hear it from the inside. It is this. The quiet years are not quiet because nothing is happening. They are quiet because you have learned to inhabit the hours differently. The urgency has gone. The urgency of child rearing, of proving yourself, of building, of worrying about what comes next. And in the space where the urgency was, something else has moved in. I am not sure I have a word for it. Presence, maybe. The capacity to be where you are. I am talking about my 70s, which I think are underrated as a decade of life. My 70s were good. I had energy, not the energy of 30, but a different kind, more selective, better aimed. I walked every morning. I gardened with the full morning available to me rather than the hour I could snatch from other responsibilities. I read a great deal. It was in my 70s that I came seriously to history. Not the history I had encountered in school, which was dates and battles and the names of kings. but the social history that had begun to be written in the latter part of the 20th century. The history of how ordinary people lived, what they ate and made and worried about and managed. I read about the medieval period, about how households functioned, how economies worked, how communities organized themselves in the absence of the infrastructure we take for granted. I read about women in particular because the social historians had begun to recognize that the history of daily life was largely the history of women's work, and that this history had been systematically undervalued and underrecorded. I read about Margaret Paston. I want to tell you about her properly, now that we have arrived in the quieter part of the evening and there is time. She was born around 1420 in Norfolk, England. She married John Paston, a lawyer and landowner, and they built a family and an estate together, and John Paston spent a great deal of his time away, in London on legal business, in prison when his enemies had arranged it, travelling on the affairs of his estate and later his legal practice. For years at a time, Margaret managed everything. The Paston Letters, the collection of correspondence between Margaret and John and their children and associates, are the most complete record we have of a medieval English household from the inside. They cover nearly 50 years, and what they show consistently and specifically is a woman running things, not holding the fort, which is the military metaphor that gets applied and which still frames her as passive, holding a position against pressure, running things, actively, making decisions, initiating. She wrote to her husband about the harvest, about the condition of the buildings, about the behavior of the servants, about the legal challenges to their property, which were constant because land ownership in 15th century England was aggressively contested and required constant vigilance. She asked for specific things: cloth, spices, medicines unavailable in Norfolk, a crossbow to defend one of their properties, and she asked directly with the efficiency of someone who has limited time for correspondence and wants it to produce results. She reported an armed attack on one of their manors. She had been at the manor with a small household. A man named Lord Mullanes had sent men to seize the property. She described what happened, what she had done, what needed to be done next. The description is not dramatic. It is operational. Here is what occurred. Here is the current situation. Here is what requires your attention and what I am handling. The historians who found the Paston Letters in the 17th century described Margaret as a dutiful wife who managed admirably in her husband's absence. The historians who studied them more carefully in the 20th century found something different, a woman with genuine authority, genuine competence, genuine judgment, who was managing not because she had been left no choice, but because she was good at it and had built the skills and relationships over years to do it effectively. The difference between those two descriptions is the difference between how women have been seen and how they have actually been. I thought about my mother. I thought about the Depression years and the account book in the drawer of the kitchen table and the way she closed it with the expression of someone who had done the arithmetic and found it acceptable, just barely, and would need to find it acceptable again next month. I thought about the war years, about the women in our town who ran their households alone, who managed the rationing and the victory gardens and the letterless weeks and the government cars in the lanes, about Mrs. Henderson, who was not waiting when the car came, who had not been waiting for 4 years, had been living fully and managing completely, and then the car came. I thought about myself in the hardware store in the summer of 1968, running it while Robert recovered, dealing with the supplier who assumed I would be easier to manage than my husband, discovering with a calm that surprised me that I was not. I read a passage from Margaret Paston's letters where she writes to John about the management of a dispute with a neighbouring landowner. She describes what she has done, what she plans to do, what she needs him to do. The language is direct and detailed and completely unsentimental. She is a woman doing her work. The work happens to be running an estate under feudal law in 15th century England. The manner is entirely recognisable. I read it and thought, I know this woman. Not her life. Her life was nothing like mine, was separated from mine by 550 years, and an ocean and a social order I cannot fully imagine. But the manner, the orientation, the understanding that things will not manage themselves and that someone has to manage them and that someone is you, the practical intelligence that moves from problem to solution without getting derailed by the problem's existence. That I know. My 70s were when I learned to live alone with something approaching contentment rather than endurance. There is a difference between those two, and for the first few years after Robert died, the difference was not available to me. I endured, I managed, I kept going. And then somewhere around my 72nd or 73rd year, without quite noticing the transition, I shifted from enduring to living. The mornings became mine in a way they had not been since before I had children. No one else's schedule to consider, no one else's needs to incorporate into the plan for the day. Just the morning, mine, long and unhurried and organized by nothing except what I found worth doing. I gardened, I walked, I read until noon sometimes. I was not lonely, or I was lonely in a way that was distinct from isolation. I was lonely for Robert specifically, which is different from being lonely in general, and the specificity of it made it bearable. My grandchildren visited, Margaret brought them on school holidays, and James brought his on summers, and they were loud in the house in the way that children are loud, and then they left, and the house was quiet again, and the quiet was not oppressive, but simply what followed the noise, the way calm follows weather. The oldest one, Margaret's daughter, Ruth, named for my mother, is something now. She is a doctor. She called me last year from wherever she was, some city I can never quite place, and told me about her work in her usual abbreviated manner, which is the manner of someone who has a great deal happening and has learned to communicate efficiently, and I thought, she knows how to run things. She comes by it honestly. She comes by it through my mother, through the depression years, through the account book in the kitchen drawer, through all of it. The chain of it. Women passing to women the knowledge of how things are managed, how things are kept, how things continue when the easy road has closed and you are required to find another. Not passed through formal instruction, not recorded in the histories until very recently, passed through the daily example of a woman cooking molasses cornbread and keeping accounts and reading letters in the kitchen and closing the account book with the expression of a woman who has found it acceptable, just barely. I understand so much more now than I did then. This is the gift of old age that they don't advertise because it comes too late to be useful in the practical sense. The understanding that most of the things you were anxious about were not worth the anxiety, and most of the things that mattered you did not recognize as mattering until they had passed. But some of it is still useful. Some of it I can give away. That is what tonight is. There is something about the autumn that I have always found particularly suited to this kind of reflection. The garden is putting itself away for winter, and there is something appropriate about that. The deliberate withdrawal, the bulbs going underground to wait, the perennials dying back to their roots. Everything that is still alive is simply not visible at the moment. It will come back. The tulips I planted last week will be there in April. I may be there in April. I may not. Both of those things are fine. I have made my peace with the temporariness of the arrangement, which is something that takes time and is worth the time it takes. The quiet years have been good years. I want to say that plainly. Not easy. I'm not using good to mean easy. Good in the sense of being fully inhabited, fully felt, fully mine. Good in the sense of the morning walk and the afternoon book and the evening lamp. Good in the sense of Dorothy's voice at 8 o'clock and Ruth's voice from whatever city she's in and the garden coming back every spring without asking my permission. Good in the sense that I am still here and the night is still beautiful and I still have things to say. I want to tell you about something that happened in my 78th year that I have thought about many times since. I was at a dinner at Margaret's house, and one of her friends, a woman perhaps 40 years old, a professor at the university, asked me, as people sometimes ask old women, what advice I would give to women of her age. The question was well-intentioned, and I answered it as best I could, but what I thought afterward was that the question contained an assumption I wanted to examine, that experience converts neatly into advice, that what I had learned could be transferred intact to a different life in a different time. It cannot, entirely. Lives are not scalable in that way. What I learned was learned in a specific context, a Depression-era farmhouse in Ohio, a post-war marriage, a small-town hardware store, a garden on a Tuesday in June that year specifically. These are not formulas, they are particulars. What can be transferred is perhaps more like a disposition, that things are manageable, that women are more capable than they are usually told, that the daily work is worth doing with full attention, that community is not a luxury but a necessity, and that the ordinary days are where the real life lives. That is what I have. That is what I would give. In my 80s, I took up watercolors. I mention this not because the painting was important. It was not, or rather it was important in the way of something private and small, which is its own kind of importance, but because it surprised me. I had not painted before. I had not thought of myself as someone who would paint. And then I found myself in a class at the senior centre because Dorothy suggested it, and I had nothing particular to do on Wednesday mornings, and the class turned out to be something I wanted to do, which led to more of it, which led to the purchase of brushes and watercolour paper and a small light on the table that I trained on the window in the afternoon. I painted the garden, mostly, the zinnias in late summer, the sweet peas in June, things I have been looking at for most of my adult life, but had never tried to see in quite that particular, deliberate, attentive way that painting requires. You cannot paint something without looking at it very carefully, and looking at something very carefully reveals that it is more complicated than you had thought, and therefore more interesting. The garden I had tended for 30 years became, through the attempt to paint it, more interesting to me than it had ever been. The lamp is still on, the window is still dark, and outside it is still October, and the Ohio evening is still doing what Ohio evenings do in October, going cool and damp and smelling of leaves and turned earth and the particular note of wood smoke that someone a few houses over has got going in their fireplace. I have been talking for a long time. That is all right. I like talking, which is something I have known since Miss Webb, who encouraged it, and something I have valued more and more as the years go on, and the circle of people who knew the same things I know gets smaller. I am 93 years old tonight. Let me say that plainly for a moment, because it is a fact that still surprises me occasionally, the way certain true things continue to be surprising no matter how long they have been true. 93 years. I was born when Calvin Coolidge was president, when a car on the county road was still something worth noticing, when my grandmother was still alive, my grandmother who had been born in 1877, in a world I cannot begin to imagine. The chain of it goes back further than I can see, and forward further than I will know. Margaret's Ruth, who is a doctor. Ruth's children, who are still small, who will be something I cannot predict, who will live in a world I will not see. I think about the chain sometimes on evenings like this, all the women in it. My grandmother, who managed a household in rural Ohio in the 1880s and 1890s with tools and circumstances that would be unrecognizable to her great-grandchildren. My mother with her account book and her molasses cornbread and her capacity to make something from very little. The women in their flour sack dresses who raised children in the Depression and did not frame this as a hardship because framing it as anything at all required time they did not have. The medieval women, Margaret Paston, writing from Norfolk in 1449 about the management of an estate under siege, writing with the directness of a person who has important things to communicate and limited time for embellishment. The chatelaines of France and England who held their households together through wars and plagues and harvests, and the endless administration of a life conducted in stone buildings with inadequate heating and insufficient light. We are all in the same chain. I feel that clearly tonight, more clearly than usual. The specific circumstances change beyond recognition. The principle does not. Women have always been the ones who kept things running, in the gaps left by history, in the absences created by war and commerce, and all the other things that have taken men away from the domestic arrangements on which all other arrangements depend. They did it without being recorded, mostly, without being credited, mostly, without being in the romantic version of history, even visible. They were visible. They were completely visible to each other, and to their children, and to the neighbours who borrowed their eggs and brought food when the harvest was bad. Invisible only to the part of history that was looking in a different direction and did not think to turn around. Tonight I am comfortable. This is not a small thing. I have the lamp. I have the chair that has fitted itself to the shape of me over the years so that sitting in it feels like being held. I have the sounds of the house settling. Old houses settle, particularly in cold weather, creaks and adjustments as the wood responds to the temperature. And I have been listening to this house settle for 31 years and know all its sounds and am not disturbed by any of them. I have the cat, who is named Thomas for my brother, and who is currently demonstrating that the quality of a good cat is the quality of a good blanket, warm and heavy and disinclined to move. I have the garden outside, gone brown now, the zinnias finished, the sweet peas done until spring. The garden will come back. It always comes back. This is the thing about gardens that I find most consoling, the returning. Every spring it returns, slightly different from what it was, slightly better in some years and slightly worse in others, but returning. The tulip bulbs I planted in the fall will be there in April. I may or may not be here in April. Both of those things are fine. I have my children. I have Margaret, who is 72 and who still has her father's hands and her grandmother's expression, and who brings soup on Thursdays and asks careful questions about how I am and listens to the answers, which is not as common a quality as it should be. I have James, who calls on Sundays with the reliability of a man who made himself a rule, and whose voice on the phone sounds more like Robert's every year, which I have not told him because I think it might alarm him, but which I find deeply comforting. I have Dorothy, 89 years old, sharp as a tack, calls every morning still. We have been calling each other every morning for 50 years. We have talked about everything. We have talked about nothing. We have sat together on the phone in comfortable silence when silence was what the morning required. She is the person who knows me best in the world now, and the world is better for having her in it, and I am better for having her in mine. The world has changed. You know this. You are living in it. The changes are large and rapid, and not all of them seem to me like improvements, but then every generation says this, and some of them are right about some of it, and all of them are wrong about the essential irreversibility of time. What I know is this: the things that sustained women through the medieval centuries and the Depression years and the war years and the post-war years and all the years since are still the same things. Practical intelligence, the capacity to find what works and use it, community, the real kind, the daily kind, the kind that consists of people who show up without being asked when showing up is what is needed. The ability to distinguish between crisis and inconvenience and to not waste energy treating one as the other. The long view, which comes slowly and is worth waiting for. And the letting go. This is what I understand now that I did not then. The fireflies, let go at the end of every summer evening. The children, launched toward lives I could not have predicted. The marriage, complete in itself, and then completed. The house in which I grew up, sold after my mother died. Thomas, my brother, gone years ago now. The account book in the kitchen drawer, the tin box on the shelf, the radio in the living room, the lane coming up from the county road with its summer edge of chicory and Queen Anne's lace. All of it held and then released. This is not loss, or rather it is loss, but it is also the right order of things. You hold what you have while you have it, completely, with full attention, and then you let it go, and what remains is the having held it. I have held a great deal. I am not sorry for any of it. The lamp is making its small sound. The cat has shifted and resettled. The house has said what it has to say for this hour. Outside, the October dark has gone entirely quiet except for the wind that comes across the flat Ohio land the way it has come across the flat Ohio land for every October of my 93 years, and for every October before that, for all the Octobers back to when there were no houses on this land at all, and the wind simply moved across it and was witnessed only by whatever was growing there. I have been glad of this life. I want to say that clearly before the night goes further. I have been glad of it, not every day, not every hour, not without difficulty or grief or the long plain stretches that are neither happy nor unhappy, but simply the middle passage of a long life. But overall, taken together, regarded from the vantage point of 93 and an October evening, I have been glad. The farmhouse is gone now, torn down sometime in the 1990s after the family who bought it let it go and the county condemned it. I did not go to see the tearing down, and I am glad I did not. I prefer to keep the copy I have in my memory intact. The morning glory stove, the loose second step from the bottom, the upstairs room with the cornhusk mattress and my sisters breathing beside me and the cold outside and the particular warmth inside that is indistinguishable in memory from safety itself. That room, that cold, that warmth, I carry it. Come. Drift now, if you like. The story is told, or as much of it as fits in one evening. The lamp will stay on for a while yet. There is no reason to hurry. The woman who waited by the window, she was never simply waiting. None of us were. We were doing what there was to do. We were keeping things. We were managing the gap between what is needed and what is available, with whatever tools God or experience or a good Depression-era mother provided. We were writing our letters and closing our account books and planning our victory gardens and letting the fireflies go in summer and pulling the quilts up in winter and continuing. That is the history the books left out. It happened anyway. It is happening now, in every house where a lamp is on and someone is still awake and managing the particular ordinary emergency of being a person in a life. I am glad you are here tonight. I am glad you found me. There is a question I have been asked in various forms over the years that I want to address here while I have the time and the lamp is still on. The question is, what was it like to be a woman then? Meaning, to live in the years I lived in, with the expectations and the limitations and the particular arrangements of that time. The honest answer is that I did not experience my own life as limited because I was inside it and it was simply the life I was living, not a deviation from some other life I might have had. I was not pressing against the edges of something. I was in the middle of it, doing the work that the middle of it contained. What I understand now, looking back, is that the edges were there. That certain things were not available to me in the way they would have been to a man with my capacities, or are available now to women of comparable capacity. The bookkeeping I did for the hardware store would, in a different time, have taken me somewhere further. The accounting course at the extension office would have led to more courses and a credential and a career in a different configuration. These things are true and I do not resent them exactly, but I want to name them clearly because pretending they were not there would be dishonest and I am too old and too uninterested in flattery to be dishonest. What I also want to say is this: the domestic work was real work. The raising of the children was real work. The management of the household was real work. It was not less than the work that was acknowledged and paid and recognized. It was simply different work of a different kind, and the failure to recognize it as work of equal weight was the limitation, not the work itself. The work was good. The invisibility of it was not. I think Margaret Paston knew this. I think my mother knew this. I think every woman who has managed an estate or a farmhouse or a two-bedroom house in Madison, Ohio, while raising 2 children and keeping the accounts and maintaining the community and tending the garden, I think every one of them understood at some level that what they were doing was necessary and real, and that the failure to record it in the history books was the history's failure, not theirs. The house is quiet. Outside, the wind has softened. The October dark has settled into itself, the way dark does in the deepest part of the night. Not empty, just still. The lamp beside my chair is making its small sound, a barely audible hum, the modern equivalent of the kerosene lamp that was always on in the kitchen of the farmhouse, that light that meant someone was awake, that light that meant home. I am not going anywhere. You can let go now. Whatever you were holding on to when you came to this evening, whatever the day carried in with it, whatever the week has been, you can set it down. There is nothing it needs from you tonight. Tonight it can wait and you can rest and the morning will be there when you are ready for it. The corn husk quilts, the sound of my sister breathing beside me, the cold outside, the warmth inside, the stove settling in the kitchen below us, the particular click and sigh of it as the fire burned down. The smell of wood smoke that I carry still. My mother's voice through the floor. The garden in August, the tomatoes coming on, the sweet peas at the fence. The radio coming to life with Glenn Miller and the whole room changed by it, by the fact that music had arrived from somewhere else and filled the space with something we had not known we were missing. Let it go slower now. Let the thoughts come slower. Robert's hands, my daughter's face, my son's laugh, Dorothy's voice on the phone at 8 o'clock in the morning. The October dark. The wind across the flat Ohio land. The lamp. You are warm. You are in the place you are supposed to be tonight, which is exactly where you are. There is nothing you are missing. There is nothing you have forgotten. There is nothing that cannot wait until morning. Sleep, if you will. Stay, if you like. I am here in the lamplight with my good cat and my October and my 93 years of a life well enough lived, and I am glad of your company, dear. I am glad of it. If you'd like, tell me where in the world you're listening from and what the night is like there. I do wonder about that. And if there's a part of a life you'd like to hear about next, something from my years, something I've touched on tonight, leave it for me. I'll be here again next week with the lamp on. Sleep well. Sleep well, dear. Come back whenever the night feels long. I post a new evening like this each week, and if you would rather listen than watch, our entire library is on Spotify. The link is in the description or pinned in the first comment below. Find me there. I'll be here.